normally there's not a lot of critical message or political messages in the charts, right? But it makes sense. Most of these musicians, they're at the top. They are making so much money. They are profiting from this system.
Exactly.
So why should they complain? This is episode 4 of Mad Makings of Music. Today we will dive deep and go way back. And if you don't only want to hear us talk, but also hear some musical examples, you can. We have made a playlist for you with all the music that we talked about in this episode. So just click on the link in the description of the episode and you can listen on YouTube or Spotify and hear all of these groundbreaking, historic, iconic songs. Some quick introductions. I am Jina Rose. I'm a singer, independent musician, producer, and I grew up in a musician's family and had some classical training, and I love to scream. And I'm here with my co-host, who happens to be my dad. His name is Mike Doctor. Say hello to the people.
Hello.
He is a lifelong musician, songwriter, composer, and we do not use that word lightly here. And yeah, he has been inspired by music of all kinds of genres his whole life. Though at heart you're a rocker, aren't you?
I started as a rocker. No, I had a couple of classical lessons.
Yeah.
But then
you found your way to rock.
The path was clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have a lot of philosophical discussions, a lot of also difficult discussions. And this topic that we're talking about today, we have thought about before. And it's this very fundamental question: should music be political?
No, absolutely no.
Why?
Well, I used to listen to lots to instrumental part of music, but it's all about love. I don't think the politics has a place in the music, but sure, if you want to, then go for it. But to me, it's all about love. Love is pain, and pain is love. And then you came. She said, I want to play punk music. I said, what? Okay.
Because I wanted to make songs about what matters to me. And the more, I saw all this suffering in the world and I understood the connections, the systemic reasons, the more angry I got. And punk really gave me an outlet for those emotions. So I think that's great. But yeah, it's funny because you already used to write songs about the environment, about the world, about the suffering in the world.
But it was lately, so.
Yeah, I mean, and I know what you mean. It's pain, it's love and all of that. But I wrote songs about similar things. Okay, maybe the difference is I actually was in also some political movements like the climate strike, and I was explicitly talking about like the system and all of that. So maybe it's a little bit more
hippie, man.
Exactly, you were there in flower power times,
60s,
man.
yeah,
exactly, right. And that's
how old I was, 10 or something. I don't remember.
Damn, but that's the thing. They were singing about. About sexual liberation, about peace in times of war. And that was a big part of that movement.
Yeah.
So it was political, but also it was,
but to me it wasn't.
Exactly.
It was all about love and drugs and
exactly,
peace,
but that's what I mean. That's what I mean. It's about freedom and peace. And that's what I'm saying. I don't know, why is it political that I want a future? Right? I don't think basic needs like water or housing or being protected from violence, I don't think those things should be up for political debates, but they are. And I think in that moment, things become political that they're really just about life and love.
You are just a modern hippie.
I am. Thank you. Yeah, but I mean that it has been a big part of music all throughout history. Many different genres were about these messages, calling for change, calling for freedom and peace. Whether we're talking about reggae, Bob Marley, he was singing against colonialism and oppression. We had, of course, blues, and from that soul, and they were singing also about equality, racism. And then you had hip hop, which was again about police brutality, and it's always been there, right? But I think we have come to agree that there is a difference between political music, as in
Like being used politically.
exactly, because what are politics, right? That's a very fundamental question. And I mean, it comes from this need of how do we organize and co-live in bigger groups of people. And then from that came this concept of government. And that's just different parties fighting for power on who gets to decide things, right? And it's a game, it's corrupt and all of that. But it's not the same thing as individuals, as independent voices calling for change or saying this is what we need as people. And so that's more going in the direction of activism, right? And so we can definitely make a difference there, whether music is being made for political reasons or like for political parties, or with in the name of activism, which really goes hand in hand with this need for expression in music, right? There's many examples for both. If we're talking about more politics in the direction of government, there's plenty of examples too, how music was used.
Absolutely.
For example, in times of Soviet Union, jazz musicians were sent into the East as ambassadors, as American ambassadors, to show cultural openness. And it was propaganda by the state.
Yeah, because there was a big racist issue in those days, and they
Yes.
sent black guys to represent America.
Yeah, to
like,
show
look,
that they don't have a race problem, man.
yeah,
That's crazy.
that's crazy.
But jazz was a genre that brought together white and black people, because it also used both black and white music. It was a combination of African American rhythms and European harmonies, and it was not as associated with race as much as blues. So it was something that bonded black and white people, and it was a very clever move of them to send them as a representation for the USA.
I think that the Russians didn't buy it.
Yeah.
They didn't buy it. But it was incredible for those people to see those great musicians live. And I mean, they went to Prague too.
Yeah.
Louis Armstrong and other jazz musicians. Yeah, and that was amazing, you know. I wasn't there, but it was like feeling a little of America, you know, because they were of course more free. Even they were black.
Yeah, and
They
still
lived in
struggling
a-
for rights.
They lived in a free society compared to Russia, right?
Yeah. But yeah, so another way in which music had a political impact is that people weren't allowed to sing in English, right? Because that was seen as American propaganda or Western propaganda again.
Yeah, that's right. You have also musical exams like you had to be able to read the notes, and then at the end of the exams you would have to say, "I love Russians." If you wouldn't do that, they wouldn't give you a license to play.
Yeah, and of course the bands who were pro Russia got support, and the other ones didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Now it's time for a little musical memory by Mike.
Yeah, well, yes, I have really some incredible story, and it starts actually with the kidnapping of a plane, which was in '72, and there were just sort of normal guys. I know some of them, and they were, you know, like DJs and young people trying to desperately leave the country, and so they kidnapped the plane. And unfortunately, there was one guy, he shot the security guy. They landed in Germany, and they've been sentenced to 5 years, some of them. Anyway, the thing is that actually it goes back to the music again, politics and music. There is this band, I don't know if it exists anymore, but this band is called Olympic, and the band leader wrote a song about this kidnapping, and it was pretty heavy. Like in the lyrics, they were like all villains, really bad people who did it, but only bad guy was the guy who was shooting the security guy. In my eyes.
Yeah, of course, that's that's horrible.
And this guy was, of course, backed up by the government who gave the money to produce this song. And this is exactly what they wanted to hear. This kind of a song, like to show the people, hey, you see, these are bad people and don't kidnap planes.
Yeah, but there is no context of how they couldn't leave the country and how they had no other choice. Of course, the moment that they chose to bring revolvers onto the plane, that's another story. And that's obviously wrong to use violence against innocent people. But yeah, how they used this story, this awful happening where they were really desperate to leave the country, and then all of this shit happens. And they just use it sort of again to make propaganda for the regime. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's how it was being used. And you can hear the awful song on Spotify.
Yeah, in our playlist.
Still there, and they have some clicks of.
Yeah, they have like 230,000 listeners.
Listeners.
Still, to this day.
That's
incredible. The communists, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, even nowadays, music is still being used for political purposes, even if it's not being written for political purposes. And there's many examples in US election campaigns. Pretty much every presidential campaign had their songs that they used for their rallies, or it's like a walk-on song, like the darts players, man.
Yeah, like a walk-on song, yeah, right.
I think the one that's to be expected is that Obama used like soul and funk, black music, right? And it was happy energy and all of that. But who also used soul music was Biden. And it was all about this unifying message, right? So, for example, he used We the People by the Staple Singers. Trump used heavy metal, which sounds kind of funny, but it had this defiant spirit. The song was called We're Not Gonna Take It by Twisted Sister. So it played into his message of like, we are standing up for our rights, right? And then we have Hillary Clinton, of course, who went for all the uplifting feminist pop songs. They even made a Spotify playlist for her campaign. And it's called Rock Out Hillary 2016 Style. Man, they really went for it. There's many examples. There was also Bush, who used a song by Tom Petty, and then he got sued and he had to stop using it. And there's many of those examples actually where politicians use songs without permission. And
that's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, they have the money. Right?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be the problem to pay the fee, but if you have to get permission, then of course not everybody will agree with your political stance, right?
They think they can allow themselves everything. They don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. They're on top of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
With Trump, there was a lot of cases where people asked him to stop using their songs, from Aerosmith over REM all the way to Neil Young. They were like, Trump, please stop. But the thing is, even though music can be used for political purposes, most music in the charts is not political. Most music is about love.
And there we go again.
So why? Why are most songs love songs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It's a basic need to express our emotions. And in the normal life, it's everything about pain and love, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, you could boil it down to everything is pain or love.
Or you have some another explanation?
No, I do think love is just a very big topic, but at the same time, everything is always about romantic love. You know what I mean? It's not love in a broad sense. It's always about romantic love. It's always about relationships and breakups.
Maybe in a deep inside of us, we are all romantic fools.
To some degree, I would agree, but no, I think it's also an obsession in our society. Everything is about romantic love. And at the same time, it's not just a question of why is it about love? I mean, it's also why is there no political message in it? But it makes sense if you think about it. At the very top,
You can think of love as a message, love for your country.
Oh yeah, that's
Oh
true.
yeah, that's a big one.
Patriotism, it's a kind of love, right?
It's a kind of a love, yes.
Sure. But normally there's not a lot of critical message or political messages in the charts, right? But it makes sense. I mean, most of these musicians, they're at the top. They are making so much money. They are profiting from this system.
Exactly.
So why should they complain?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure.
And also, it can really be bad for your career if you take a clear stance. For example, the Dixie Chicks singer once made a statement at her concert where she said something along the lines of being ashamed that Bush is an American, right? And then it really hit their career. They stopped being played on radios. And live, they were able to tour again, but on radio, they basically never recovered. And I think, yeah, it's really strong if you can take such a stance, but it does come with repercussions. And I think that's definitely also a reason why a lot of musicians aren't political.
You have to be aware of those things nowadays. I don't think it was like the case like 50 years ago that they would use the power to stop your voice. I don't think it was like that, but maybe I'm just too naive. Maybe it was there all the time, you know. But my advice, watch it.
But so what we're talking about is free speech, right? And the more commercial your art becomes, the more you have to watch it and not be too political, it seems, at least. But honestly, can art even exist separate from politics? I mean, even if you're not taking a political stance, you are still making a political statement. Even the decision of not being political because you want to sell your art, it's a political move, right?
Yeah, well, there is the folk music. For that kind of a music, which is really totally existing apart from the politics, then you would have to go to places like India or Nepal or, you know, places where they still making music traditional way and don't care about politics, although they have to perform. Again, and when you need money, when you need the gigs to survive with your music, then you are involved again with the politics a little bit. You will have to get a visa to come to Switzerland, and then you have to ask around who has the money, where you can play, and then in comparison to pop music, and so it's still not that political.
Yeah, so of course, music can be unpolitical if it's instrumental music and...
Well, that's why I love instrumental music, you know. Without lyrics, it's more abstract. And it has nothing to do with the politics because there are no words.
Yeah. You are always positioning yourself to society. So even the love song is political in a sense, even if it's not the intention. I mean, there's always ideas behind it of how love should be, whether we're talking about it should be straight, it should be monogamous, or as I said, it's always about romantic love and not other kinds of love.
You sound like your intention is to make out of everything a political issue.
I'm just saying everything.
Even out of
no,
love,
everything. Yeah, but it is. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to make a political issue out of it, but it is a system that upholds a hierarchy, that gives certain people privileges and power over others. It makes our identities political. It makes love political. You know what I mean? And it shouldn't be like that, but it is.
I don't know. I think when you have a guitar and sing about love, what is politic about it? It has nothing to do with the politics. Maybe when you become big they use it, that's what you're talking about.
No,
probably,
I can tell you what's political about it. For example, if you're queer, suddenly it's political, even if you're just singing about love.
No, but let's leave that out. Queer people.
Why?
Yeah, because that's not a really good example for everybody.
It doesn't have to be for everybody. That's what I'm talking about. If you're white, you are straight, you're a man, then it's not political.
Now we're getting political.
No, that's what I'm talking
about. The minorities,
yeah,
right?
That's what I'm talking about. If you're a minority, suddenly everything you do is political, even if you're just existing as you were born. You know what I mean? And it's for example, you say, what is political about love? Well, let's talk about interracial love songs. Man, it didn't exist. And it was a very, very big deal when in 1968, the first interracial love song got into the charts. That was a huge deal. And it's just about love. Why is it political? It's political because these identities were politicized.
Yeah, okay. But when we talk so-called not queer people, how you call it?
Straight people?
Straight people. Okay, straight people then. Hetero.
Sure.
When a hetero singing about love, how do you explain the political issue in it? I don't understand.
Yeah, but that's the only way in which you can make music without being political, if you aren't yourself being seen as political. A love song can exist outside of politics, as you say, and I think that's a good thing. It should be able to exist, but also it's a privilege in a way. Yeah, or another example where identities are politicized is when language becomes an issue. Just as we said in the time of the USSR, and like people weren't allowed to sing in English, but it's much worse if you're not allowed to sing in your own language. And that's an example in francoist Spain, where people, well, they were expected to sing in Spanish, of course, but then we're talking about Catalan people whose language is not really Spanish, and they were not allowed to sing in Catalan, and that was a huge political statement, and it came together with the movement of Nueva Cancion in Latin America already. Under military dictatorships, they faced a lot of censorship and violence, but yeah, this movement was able to find power through music again. And it's been like that for a long time, that people find power through music. And because of that, also through history, music has been forbidden to certain degrees. Christian missionaries who prohibited Inuit from throat singing, for example, or the slaves in the USA who they found power through music. They could organize and communicate, and so they weren't allowed to use instruments anymore. All they had was their voice, right? And I think it brings us right into the beginning of blues. Even though blues was not technically the music of slaves, it was technically the music of freed people, right? But even after slavery was abolished, it took 100 years until they were really allowed to vote. But yeah, so actually blues started in this time after slavery was abolished, and they were still struggling for their rights, and a lot of the songs are about the farms that they worked on, but also the prison farms, which was basically just a continuation of slavery. But now it was, under the pretense of, oh, they're criminals. And I would say that issue of criminalizing Black people goes on to this day. But anyway, a lot of legendary blues musicians came from that time. Muddy Waters, B.B. King, they were singing about the sharecropping. But so it started on the countryside in the rural South. And eventually, people were moving into the north, into the cities. And there, actually, blues started becoming commercial for the first time. And did you know that women were at the forefront of blues at that time? Well, this guy who wanted to make blues commercial, W.C. Handy was his name. He called himself the father of blues. He knew that like this archetype of the real blues man who is like really solitary, playing in his suffering sort of, that it wasn't, really commercially viable. And so he went for the women who had been performing for a long time in the vaudeville scene, which was essentially variety shows. They really knew how to perform. And that's why they were a great fit to bring the blues to the people, to sell it. And so the first person ever to record the blues, well, in a professional recording studio, and the first Black recording artist was Mamie Smith. So this blues song called Crazy Blues, which was released in the year 1920, sold almost 1 million copies.
That's incredible.
That's huge. So it was really the first breakthrough of Black music. So all the big labels jumped on it and they started producing so-called race records, is what they still called it at the time. It took a long time until they stopped calling it race records and instead called it rhythm and blues. But yeah, so that's where a lot of those famous female blues singers came from. That's also Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. And they really found this platform to express themselves. They could sort of find a little bit of sexual liberation. They could talk about the abuse of men. They could really express themselves, which was a great thing and a rare thing for women at the time. A quick note from the editing room. How could I forget to mention that some of these blues women were even singing queer songs? Like Ma Rainey, she had different stage personas. In one of them, she was wearing a suit and a tie and singing really queer songs, like the Prove It On Me blues, which she released in the year 1928. A time when nobody was allowed to be publicly queer. And she was singing about how she doesn't like men, how she was talking to the gals just like any old man. And the chorus is all about how people should not say she's doing it if they cannot prove it on her. What an icon. Of course, this song is in our playlist too, which is pretty long, just like this episode, packed with information and history. Because once I started diving into this topic of politics and music, my research took me down so many rabbit holes and I just realized how connected everything is. So it's really interesting. Also a lot of info dumping. I hope you enjoyed the ride and go check out that playlist. The link is in the description. That's when things take a really strange turn. Because nowadays we don't hear so much about these women in blues. Everything is about these blues men, right? We think it's a male territory, but there were really important women. However, some people, both Black and white, scholars, they thought, well, this is not the real blues. The real blues comes from suffering, and the real blues is played there on the countryside by these men. And so they went and started recording these sort of real bluesmen, which is on one hand an incredible thing, because now we have these authentic recordings of people who wouldn't have been able to go to the city and record in a recording studio. So that's great. But on the other hand, it's sort of took away again the spotlight from these women. Yeah. And suddenly it wasn't selling anymore because people thought, well, that's not the real blues, right? But it was a real blues too. It was the city blues. It was the story of those people who came into the cities, into the north, who were facing new struggles. But it was also happy. It was also about pleasure. And they were fucking rock stars, man. They were the first rock stars. And then it was all taken away from them because these guys, and actually they are now called the Blues Mafia, isn't that something? Because they said, well, that's not the real blues. And the real blues should be about suffering and misery. And I think that in itself is so racist, actually. Like, it can't be happy. Blues can't be happy, can't be commercial or what. And it can't be female. I think that's a part of blues history that not many people know about. I didn't even know about it until I did the research, right? Right?
No.
I mean, of course, we know the names sometimes, but to know that they played such an important part in like bringing blues
Pioneers,
to
man.
the people. Yeah,
Incredible.
they were pioneers. Exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it's a really complex thing with these white men who went and recorded the bluesmen in the South. Because on one hand, wow, now we have these recordings, for example, Robert Johnson, and we really know how they played it and where it came from. That's amazing. But at the same time, it's kind of racist too that they decided what blues is about. And there's also an example, this guy, he was called McCormick. In the 70s, he really tried to get the exclusive rights for all of Robert Johnson's recordings. It wasn't just in the name of those bluesmen, it was also about having control of them.
Yeah. Was basically the capitalism again, exploiting people.
Yeah.
And we had the opportunities to record the music and these things, the technical possibilities. That's where it started, exploiting musicians.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it started with white supremacy. Yeah, and in this case also, I mean, those city blues singers, they were making money. Man,
They were making money.
Mamie
Wow.
Smith was making a lot of money. She was living like a luxurious life. It was incredible. Who else was doing that as a black woman? And then I
Wow.
think that's also something that they didn't like, right? And so if they go into the South and they record these bluesmen, they never got a penny for that shit, probably. And so they can again just profit from their art, right? And we will see it keeps being the same struggle for independence and for the right to make your art and not have people steal your art. That's a big deal. Well, there's another pioneer that I want to mention, who is Marian Anderson. She was a very talented black singer. She could do opera, spiritual. She could do a lot of different things, right? And she was the first ever black person to perform at the White House. And the way that went is that, she was very talented, but the conservatories, they did not take people of color at that time. However, a lot of people were supporting her, and she was very supported by the congregation. They even made a fund for her, and so she could take singing lessons. And then her Italian voice master, Boghetti, he entered her into a contest, and she won against 300 other contestants.
Wow.
And so she won a solo appearance with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra at 17 years old.
Wow.
And from there, she went to Europe. She had success in Paris, and she came back. And so she got a gig at Carnegie Hall, and she broke her foot the night before. But she went anyway. It was really important to her, obviously, and to people everywhere like her. And she was standing on one foot, giving her concert. And then after that, she got the invitation to the White House. And the thing is, she had this huge success, and still she had to face racism. Like, she got to stay at a luxurious hotel, but she wasn't allowed into the dining room.
Oh my goodness.
After all that she had accomplished, even then, right? And so it was, she still had to keep fighting her whole life. There was an instance where she wanted to sing at the Constitution Hall in Washington. Her manager tried to get her the gig, but they didn't want to have her in there. And following that, even Eleanor Roosevelt was on her side and made a really public statement. And then they organized that she could sing instead on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And 750,000 people showed up of all races to support her. So yeah, it was a fight, but again, there were moments in time where there was really success and where people came together through it. And I think it's just so impressive, all the things that she did, even though the odds were really always against her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I already mentioned this first interracial love song. That was 1968. So it seems like there was so much progress, right? People of color were also starting to be allowed into music, right? But then suddenly rock and roll became white. How did that happen? Because it started with blues and rhythm.
Yeah, and as far as I know, was the Chuck Berry who started it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Little Richard.
Yeah, those are two big names.
There
Yeah.
are two big names.
Yeah, so let's take a look historically. I mean, it started with blues, right? And this was called race records. That's what they called it. 1949, they changed it to rhythm and blues. And then suddenly happened this split where they said, okay, now we have rock and roll and soul. Suddenly, race music was soul and rock and roll was for white people. And
Yeah, like on the radio.
the billboards, the charts, they had this name,
and
right?
on the radio they would just play soul music, or another channel would having a rock and roll vibe.
Yeah, it was never mixed, right? It was this is for white audiences and this is for black audiences. Exactly. But the thing is, in the beginning, we had like Chuck Berry playing rock and roll. People didn't really like it. I mean, some people did, for sure. Some people loved it because it was very exciting. It was very raw, right? But a lot of people thought, oh, it's too rough and it's too black. And but then white people started picking it up, started playing the same songs, and they got a lot of attention with it, a lot of success. And so it became eventually more accepted. And it took a few years, but 1956, for the first time, did the originals, that means the black musicians, have more success than the white musicians with the rock and roll after Chuck Berry's Maybelline. But it's really that the moment where rock and roll wasn't associated with blackness anymore so much, that's when they changed the name to rock and roll, and instead the black people were playing soul, right? So basically it was not this just a natural development. It was a very conscious segregation in music. Once again, after all of this struggle for equality, it came back to this again.
And since then, there was no black rock and roll band except one, and that was the Living Color.
Yes.
And then think how many years, and only one band.
Yeah, I mean, there's sure some small ones, but if we're talking about the really famous ones, if we're talking about the ones in the charts, it's all white people. And I think a lot of people think of it as a white genre, and that's just not true. It would be nothing without black musicians who really started it all. I think it becomes clear that music is in itself very political, because we can't just ask who was making music, but it's really about who was heard, who had the accessibility to record their music, to preserve their music, who got financed, right? Who even was let into the industry. And this issue of racism and misogyny is not just an issue of blues and rock and roll. I mean, even in classical music, it's a big issue, right?
Yeah, you don't see a black guy in the big orchestras.
Yeah.
Classic orchestras. Yeah, that's incredible.
But I mean, we think of it as this very European genre, right? Classical music. But the thing is, in the past, it used to have a lot more influences from different cultures, whether we're talking about jazz or native music. They did take a lot of different influences, but at some point in history, that stopped. And really, this is the story of how fascism killed classical music. That sounds crazy, but it's kind of true.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if we take Dvorak, for example, he went to the USA. He was the...
Director of the conservatory
Which
in
one?
New York.
In New York, right?
In New York,
yeah. So big deal, right?
Big deal.
And he was really conscious about being open to different influences. And that's how he wrote his Symphony Number 9 from the New World.
And he was talking to the Americans. Why don't you use the native music or the black music?
He was aware
Why
that it had so much to offer.
Yeah, and it's in your country.
Yeah.
You know, so he couldn't understand that, and Americans just didn't go for it because racism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
okay.
apparently, before the performance of this symphony, he even made it clear that there's influences from native music in there. So he was very aware about it. And he was surely not the only composer who had these influences. So what happened? If you want to find out, you'll have to listen to part 2 of this episode. And while we're at it, if you've been enjoying this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating, leave a good review, tell your friends about it. It will really mean a lot to us.